Dive watches seem to be the most popular genre of watches, and the most iconic is arguably the Rolex Submariner. But there were some other brands that made significant contributions to their development. So let's take a little stroll down memory lane and rediscover the history of dive watches, shall we? That's coming up right after this. We all know humidity, dust, water, and the environment in general can be kryptonite to our favorite watches if not properly protected. For the most part, the fragility of pocket watches didn't make them a practical conversion to wristwatches, which would have to deal more directly with the elements and shock of day-to-day tasks. There was nothing but weak points when you considered the gaps in the crown and the case assembly pieces. As you might guess, one of the first solutions to these problems came from Rolex, in the form of a hermetically sealed case in 1922. It was known as the Submarine. Now, don't get excited yet, this isn't the subby so many love and adore. The Submarine attempted to conquer the elements by creating an external case for the watch. The cover would be screwed onto the bottom piece, encasing the actual watch inside. This wasn't a perfect solution, as the grooves that screwed the case together would wear out quickly, and in order to access the crown, you would have to unscrew the case. A solution to the chunky period piece that offered a case within a case was already being addressed by a master casemaker named François Borel, who filed 2 patents in 1891 and 1903 for a triptych-style case. The case consisted of a threaded ring, which is where the dial and movement would be seated. Then the case back and bezel would be screwed into that threaded ring, which created a secure seal without the extra case solution Rolex offered in 1922. While this solved the sealing of a majority of the case, there was still a nasty little Achilles heel to address, and that was the crown, still acting as the movement's grim reaper, letting the elements into the case. Paul Perregaux and Georges Perret were determined to stop the element's assaults on the movement and filed a patent in 1925 for a screw-down crown. See how it's all coming together? As with modern-day developments, you never really want to buy the first version of something, as there's always some kinks that need to be worked out. This was indeed the case with Perregaux and Perret's design. If you think about your modern screw-down crown, when you secure the crown, you're turning it in the direction that winds the movement. That would be opposite to this design. In order to secure the crown, you turned it against the ratchet wheel. This means that if you unscrewed the crown, you turned in the direction that was winding the movement. As a result of this, if the movement was fully wound, set, and then the crown secured, you couldn't unscrew the crown again until the mainspring wound down a little bit, or you'd risk damaging the movement by overwinding it. The other major issue with the patent was the material that was used to create the seal between the crown and the case. You can see that material represented by the number 16 in this particular image. Because of limited manufacturing at the time, the material used for the seal was leather, cork, or felt, and it was located on the outside of the case, which meant it needed to be replaced more often than would be practical. Rolex's founder, Hans Wilsdorf, immediately saw the potential in combining the screwed-together case from François Borel and the screw-down crown from Perregaux and Perret. Wilsdorf purchased the rights from their inventors and applied the patents in the US, UK, and Germany from 1926 to 1927. Rolex took the existing invention and found solutions to the 2 major issues. First, they moved the seal from being outside the case to being inside the crown tube, and they made it from lead, increasing its durability. They also solved the winding issue when unscrewing the crown. The culmination of Hans's hard work came in 1926 with the release of the Rolex Oyster, making this reference the first waterproof watch, but still a long way from a dive watch. They showcased the water resistance of their watch in 1927 when Hans convinced swimmer Mercedes Gleitz to wear the Rolex Oyster on a necklace during her swim. The performance of the Oyster was rewarded with a first-page spot on the Daily Mail paper. This watch was still a long way from a diver, and there is a reason Hans put the watch on a necklace rather than on Mercedes' wrist for her long swim. So let's keep chugging and see how this evolves. There were other companies coming up with water-resistant solutions, such as Cartier, with the model known as the Pasha de Cartier, which had a screw cap that went over the crown, and it's also one of the earliest examples of a waterproof watch. As the mid-1920s progressed, Diving for scientific and military purposes was coming into its own, and the existing pieces were simply not able to support the demand of those dives. The first watch that would be used by divers came in 1932 in the form of the 1932 Omega Marine. Thus, the Marine became the world's first literal dive watch, the first watch to work with and be used by divers. It was a modern design for the time and would now more likely be confused for a JLC Reverso than an Omega Marine, despite the fact that both came out around the same time. It was during this piece's development that the crystal began to be installed from above the bezel rather than below, something that we still do today. The Omega Marine had two distinct pieces that secured it together to keep water resistance and was also the first watch to use synthetic sapphire, a big step forward in reliability. The band was made of seal leather due to its resistance against salt water. With its successful service to divers, Omega released the Marine Standard in 1939, the first dive-tested watch for the masses. Another manufacturing contribution of the Marine Standard can be found in how the watertight seal was accomplished. Because the rectangular design kept them from using the threaded cases of the Rolex Oyster, Omega used rubber gaskets, which are still used today. By this time, nearly all the innovations needed for a modern dive watch had been developed. In the early 40s, the Italian military collaborated with Panerai and Rolex to develop a watch for their military divers, partially as a result of World War II. Italian forces wanted water resistance and readability underwater. Readability was achieved by a material called radiomere, which, as we know now, is radioactive and particularly devastating to those that ended up applying the material to Panerai dials. The water resistance was achieved by the now iconic Panerai crown guard, which kept the case watertight but still allowed the movement to be wound, even with the guard engaged. The collaboration with Rolex saw them supplying these Panerai-designed cases and even some movements for the company's effort. These pieces debuted in 1943 as the reference 6152 TAC 1. Although Panerai didn't file the iconic patent until 1956, I suspect they were a little preoccupied with the World War. These advances slowly but surely increased the water resistance of watches. At that current time, water-resistant watches only provided the time for divers, and the military demanded more functionality. One of the leaders from an elite French diving team, Bob Malaubière, made a drawing of a watch that he thought would help meet some of the needs of his elite French divers. After approaching several brands, Bob was denied, until he found Blancpain, who worked with Malaubière to create what would become one of the world's most iconic dive watches, the 50 Fathoms, which was released in 1953. This piece is incredibly significant because it represents the first watch that incorporated all the characteristics that comprise even a modern-day dive watch, and standards that would be set in the ISO 6425 certification standard that dive watches undergo today. It had a rotating bezel and 3 hands that would indicate to the user that it was still functional. Because a screw-down crown was patented by Rolex at the time, Blancpain used double O-ring seals around the crown to attain its water resistance, which, as you can guess, was 55 fathoms or 91 meters. At the time, that was deeper than any divers had been and could go with the current technology. Some of the innovations that stand today, like a unidirectional ratcheting bezel, were actually incorporated by the then director of Blancpain, Jean-Jacques Herpeter, who was himself an experienced diver. The world's most iconic diver, the Rolex Submariner, would debut at Basel Watch Fair 1 year later, in 1954. Ian Fleming would write a book with an iconic hero wearing a Rolex Oyster Perpetual, and less than 10 years later, it would be worn by Sean Connery as James Bond in 1962's Dr. No. As beloved as the watch is, additional developments in dive watches wouldn't come from the Rolex Submariner, but from the Rolex Deep Sea, which would become the only watch to reach the deepest point on our planet, with Jacques F. Piccard and Don Walsh aboard the Bathyscaphe Trieste. At nearly 1.5 inches thick, the Deep Sea and its incredible dimensions were secured to the outside of the submersible. As underwater adventures continued and divers spent longer periods in deeper waters, another nemesis to our watches was discovered: helium, with several divers reporting the ejection of their watches' crystals as they swam back up to the surface. Rolex and Doxa were determined to find a solution. Doxa and Rolex both contend to have arrived at the helium escape valve solution first, of course. It was, however, Doxa who patented the design in 1969, the same year they released the first watch to have the helium escape valve, the Doxa Sub 300T Conquistador, which was released a whopping 2 years before the Rolex Sea Dweller. The Conquistador also featured a no decompression table on its bezel that was developed with US dive companies and would tell the diver the longest time they could stay underwater before having to head towards the surface without needing decompression stops along the way. These days, the ISO 6425 standard defines what a true dive watch is and the tests that it has to pass in order to be certified as such. It was a long road of innovation and contributions from the likes of Rolex, Omega, Panerai, Blancpain, and Doxa that gave us the foundation needed to desk dive with modern dive watches. Links to references and pictures used in this video will all be in the video description. If you enjoyed this video or found it useful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And as always, if this is your first time here, don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this. That's it for this one. CG, out.